Beliefs in reincarnation have existed for a very long time, going back to many ancient societies. But it wasn't until relatively recently that science actually examined these claims. And among all the investigators, one name sticks out. The former head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia, psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, the first and most prolific researcher to truly question if reincarnation is real. In this video, we'll go into his early life, his research, and his ultimate beliefs and conclusions on reincarnation. Born on October the 31st in 1918 Canada, Ian would develop an interest in more mystic pursuits, largely due to influences in his upbringing. Ian suffered from bronchitis and was often bedridden, spending most of his early life reading. His mother had an interest in theosophy, which was at its most powerful point at this time. She had an extensive library of their writings that Ian would read as a child. Now, if you don't know what theosophy is, then click on this video, which explains their history and beliefs. As he got older, he would also start to read from the Society for Psychical Research, a UK organization trying to investigate paranormal or psychic claims. He would develop a personal admiration for the founders, and even go on to meet with leaders of the American branch. He would graduate from medical school in 1943 in Canada, before moving to Arizona to take up residency at St. Joseph's Hospital. An accomplished psychiatrist, he would start to travel to work in different hospitals and universities around the United States. In the late 40s, he would start to focus on psychomatic medicine at a hospital in the state of New York. Psychomatic medicine is a medical area studying the relationship between the body health and mental states, or when illnesses are believed to have a psychological component. In the 50s, he would meet with Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, and he would influence Ian to experiment with psychedelics, mainly LSD. By the end of the 50s, he had been appointed as the head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. Now, his study of psychosomatic medicine would lead him to consider ways other than environment or hereditary pressures that could account for conditions observed in his patients, such as fears, sicknesses, or even unique personality traits. This is where the idea of reincarnation would come in, that his patients had experienced things in previous lives, and that form of memory or personality recollection could have an influence on their current life. He would start to write about parapsychology, ESP, and psychosomatic illnesses, even winning an award for his work for a paper submitted to the American Society for Psychical Research for Best Essay, Paranormal Mental Phenomena and Their Relationship to the Problem of Survival of the Human Personality After Bodily Death. Ian's paper was a review of past cases where individuals had claimed to remember events about past lives. Because of this award, he would meet with Eileen Garrett, acclaimed psychic who had founded the Parapsychology Foundation. Impressed with Ian, she would give him a grant to travel and interview people who were claiming to have these experiences of past lives. Not only her, but Chester Carlson, an acclaimed physicist, would take an interest in Ian and offer to supply even more funding. Carlson would take a much more personal interest in Ian, and the two would even become close friends. When Carlson died in 1968, he would leave $1 million, the equivalent of over $9 million in today's money, for the university to fund Ian's work. This allowed him to create his own division in the psychiatry department. He would resign from his role as chairman of the Department of Psychiatry and would start the Division of Personality Studies, which would later be renamed to the Division of Perceptual Studies. With these resources now at his disposal, Ian would start to regularly travel around the world to investigate cases of suspected reincarnation. How the investigation of these cases would go was somewhat standardized. Ian would hear a story of someone claiming experiences or memories from a past life. He would travel to where they were and interview them, then look for evidence that could explain their testimony other than reincarnation, such as fraud, self-delusion, coincidence, or even a translational misunderstanding that may have occurred. Cases themselves were also generally very similar. Young children, typically from ages 2 to 4, would start to talk about their past life to others, and even ask their parents to let them travel to where they previously lived. If the child would make accurate statements or seem convincing enough to the parents, they would start to question them seriously or even try to verify their story. Eventually, the news would spread. Stevenson had networks of volunteer informants who would relate to him when this occurred, but generally it would take years after a child started speaking of a former life for their parents to attempt any verification, and years more for Ian to both hear about it and then travel to the area. He spent most of his professional life on excursions interviewing these children who claimed to have memories of past lives, even bringing along journalist and eventual senior editor of the Washington Post, Tom Schroyer, with the hopes of increasing awareness of his research. Tom would go on to write Old Souls, the scientific search for proof of past lives, where he would discuss their travels, with such excerpts as, "He was meticulous, almost obsessively so. For every case he conducted interviews with multiple witnesses, looked for physical marks, verified records, and sought alternative explanations. He wanted to rule out every possible natural case before considering the supernatural." Over the years, Ian would collect some 3,000 of these cases, and even though we don't have time to go through all of them, I would like to touch on a few. Starting with the case of Swanalata Mishra. She was born in 1948 in India, and around the age of 3 would start to speak of her past life memories. While traveling through the city of Kanti with her father, she would ask the driver to change directions to go to her house, saying that they could get better tea there than on their route. He was confused by this, as the family lived over 100 miles away, and she had never been to this city before. 2 years later, she would start to dance and sing in Bengali, a language she had never learned or even had the opportunity to learn, given that she lived entirely among Hindi speakers. Even her dancing was in a style not native to the region. Over the next few years, she would increasingly speak of her memories of living with her old family in Kanti. Eventually, her new family would become acquainted with a woman who had lived in Kanti, and when Mishra asked to meet with her, she would declare that she had known her in her previous life. At the age of 10, her father started to record her statements, making a diary of any details she claimed to recall. The following year, researchers from the Department of Parapsychology at a local university would investigate the case, creating additional records of her memories and confirming that there was indeed a house in Kanti that matched her description, with a family of the same name that she recalled. The family even had a daughter named Bia who had died 10 years before Mishra was born, and whose life events matched what she had been describing. As for the 10-year age gap, she would say that she had experienced an additional life in between those two. Ian would arrive in 1961 to interview her, as well as her extended family, and would later send his assistants to gather more information in 1963. He noted during his interviews that she behaved very similar to a normal child, if a little more serious, when she was with other children or at her new home, but would start to act much older when at the house of her old family, even taking on an older sister demeanor with men more than 40 years older than her. Ian did note, however, that it was possible that her new family could have learned the details that she related about her old family through public knowledge, as they were somewhat well known in the area. He says there is no evidence of this, and that she was able to recount things that would not have been in the public mind, such as knowledge that Bia had gold fillings in her front teeth, and being able to recognize members of that family and their relationship to Bia. The method of questioning her wouldn't be as simple as putting her in front of a man and having him ask, "Am I your son?" as that would be far too leading. Instead, different people would be put before her, and she was asked to describe who they were, with attempts made to mislead her and even deny that she had given the right answer at times. Every time, she was able to accurately describe who was and was not a relation of Bia and their relationship to her. She would be one of the few to not have her claimed past life memories fade as she grew older, continuing to visit her family once a year to celebrate an annual festival. Victor Vincent died in 1946 in the town of Angoon, Alaska. He was a member of the Tlingit people, an indigenous group native to that region. Historically, the Tlinglits had believed in reincarnation and had a much more developed view of it than other native groups, very similar to Buddhism with some karmic ideas, leading some anthropologists to hypothesize that the belief had migrated to Alaska from Siberia over the centuries, though they still held the unique belief that reincarnation can only occur through relatives, and that birthmarks could be used to identify those who had been reborn. By the time of the 20th century, nearly the entire population had converted to Christianity, but some of their original beliefs still lingered in many minds. Before Victor died, he would say to his niece, "I'm coming back as your next son. I hope I don't stutter as much as I do now. Your son will have these scars." The scars he were referring to were surgical scars on his back, a very unique mark surrounded by needle points, though he also had an additional scar on his nose. 18 months after Victor died, his niece gave birth on December 15, 1947, to a son she named Corliss Chotkin, and her son did indeed have the same scar as Victor in the same place, as well as an additional matching scar on his nose, with Ian writing that the mark on the back of Corliss was much more characteristic of an operating scar. At 13 months, when being pressed by his mother to say his name, Corliss would exclaim, "Don't you know me? I'm Coyote." Coyote being the name of the tribe that Victor had been a member of. Later, at 2 years old, while being taken around the town in Skeeta, Corliss would recognize a stepdaughter of Victor and call out to her, jumping up and down and saying, "There's my Susie." Not only did he know her English name, but also her Tinglet name. At the same age, he also recognized Victor's son William, seeing him on the street and exclaiming, "There is William, my son." At 3 years of age, he recognized the widow of Victor, Vincent, at a large meeting of Tinglets, saying, "There's the old lady," and "There's Rose." Rose being her name, and old lady being a phrase Victor would often call his wife. He would do this with many of Victor's friends over the years, calling out to them in pet names that only Victor was known to use, all of this occurring before he turned 6 years old. He also shared many personality traits with Victor. Both were deeply religious, and Corliss spoke with a stutter, although somewhat less than Vincent had. Ian would visit Southeast Alaska 4 times between 1961 and 1965. Corliss was 15 when he met with Ian, and by this point he couldn't remember anything of the events that had occurred in his childhood or anything of a previous life. Ian interviewed his mother and local witnesses who all confirmed the aforementioned events. Now, this next case wasn't investigated by Ian, but rather by one of his successors, Dr. Jim Tucker. But it's so interesting, I want to cover it regardless. James Leininger was born April 10, 1998, in America. When he was almost 2 years old, his father took him to a flight museum near Dallas, Texas, where James showed a high level of interest in World War II planes. Shortly after this, he developed a habit of smashing 2 toy planes together and saying "airplane crash on fire." And it wouldn't take long after this for him to start having nightmares of being in a plane crash. This went on for several months, with him often being awoken screaming and thrashing. His parents would question this, and James responded, saying that they were memories of the past, that he had been shot down by the Japanese while flying a Corsair fighter plane during World War II. A few months later, he would go further, saying that he had flown from a carrier named Natoma and that he had flown with a man named Jack Larson. When he was around 2.5, he pointed to a photo of Iwo Jima at the base of Mount Subarachi, saying, "That's where my plane was shot down." He even started drawing hundreds of pictures of battle scenes of airplanes, signing them all as James 3. His parents, worried by this, started to reach out to both the U.S. Navy and past life researchers. The name Natoma that James had given was in reference to the Natoma Bay, an escort carrier that had been in the Pacific Theater during the war. At a reunion for the ship's crew, James' father would learn about the only pilot who was lost at Iwo Jima, James M. Hudson Jr. He, along with Jack Larson, were part of a small group of pilots who had attacked Japanese transport vessels after the main battle. His plane crashed in the same way as described by young James, and Pilot James, being a junior, is what the parents believed caused young James to sign his drawings as James 3, the third James in a line. Dr. Jim Tucker, a member of the Division of Perceptual Studies, would interact with the family, interviewing them when James was 12 years old. He wrote that they were very forthcoming during his questioning, and he would contact the then 91-year-old sister of James Hudson to attempt to corroborate their testimony. As a psychiatrist, specifically one with a focus in psychosomatic medicine, Ian was always looking for an explanation for unusual behavior. He reasoned that if no one in the subject's family acted similarly, it couldn't be genetics. And if no one raised the same way acted similarly, it couldn't be the environment. This is where past experiences from a previous life would come in as what he saw as the most likely explanation. Ultimately, although Ian would say that he couldn't definitively prove reincarnation, it was the best explanation to explain the testimony and behavior of the patients. He would posit that reincarnation was the third component, along with genetics and environment, in the development of personality. When talking about what Ian considered unusual behavior, he mostly referred to unique phobias, abilities, or types of illnesses. The unique fears were usually related to how the subject believed they had died in their recollected previous life. For unique traits, he gives the example of a series of children from Myanmar that claimed to be past Japanese soldiers who preferred to wear Japanese clothing and even preferred to eat raw fish over traditionally spicy Burmese food. In one of the more unorthodox stances on transgenderism, he mentioned that having a previous life in a different sex could cause individuals to feel disconnected from their new body and want to transition back to their original sex. He did have subjects who claimed to have had previous lives in different sexes, but mentioned that cultural differences may play a role, as in areas where people didn't believe sex change was possible, there would be none of these cases, with most of them occurring in areas that did have this belief in change, such as Thailand and Myanmar. Moving on to his critics. As a researcher, Ian would consistently publish his work to the broader scientific community, and although he would receive some support, with articles in the Journal of the American Medical Association and the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disorders interested in his work, most other scientists would be very critical if they engaged with him at all. Naturally, ideas of any supernatural phenomenon are often ridiculed in scientific circles, and most researchers opposed to his work would make the same series of critiques. That he had asked leading questions, the families were lying to him, and that he had a confirmation bias towards reincarnation. One of the more interesting arguments against his work was the idea that children in cultures with reincarnation are more likely to claim to recall a past life, and that these claims were simply cultural artifacts. Ian would respond to this, arguing that those societies were simply more likely to listen to children claiming past memories. Even considering this, of the somewhat 1,300 cases that he had claimed reincarnation as the most probable explanation, the United States had the largest amount. One of Ian's assistants, Champ Ransom, would write a report on the work that he had been involved with. Paul Edwards, a philosopher, would use this report in two of his publications to further criticize Ian's research. Edwards claimed that according to this report, Ian had not only asked the children leading questions and filled in gaps in their stories, but that there was far too much time between when a subject claimed to recall a memory and when Ian would interview them. After all, many of the subjects that Ian had interviewed didn't remember any of the claims that they had made as children regarding previous life memories. Despite the criticism, Edwards still had some good things to say, calling Ian the preeminent defender of reincarnation and saying, "I have the highest regard for his honesty. All of his case reports contain items that can be made the basis of criticism. Stevenson could easily have suppressed this information. The fact that he did not speaks well for his integrity." Even Carl Sagan would comment on Ian's work, stating that although he didn't believe in reincarnation, the phenomenon of past memories should be studied further. And further study would occur. The division steadily grew, first in 1964 with Gareth Pratt joining, then with two more psychologists, Rex Stanford and John Palmer, in the 70s. Even more would join in the following years, with the division growing throughout the 80s. The group even went international, with support and collaboration from researchers at the University of Iceland and the University of Tasmania. Today, the Division of Perceptual Studies has a dozen researchers and continues to publish papers on their work. In 2002, Ian would step down as the Director of Perceptual Studies. Although somewhat retired, he would still work as a research professor at the University of Virginia. In 2007, Ian Stevenson would pass away, starting his last great experiment. Back in the 60s, he had set a combination lock and placed it into a cabinet at the department, with the idea that he would try to pass along the code after his death. His colleagues would wait to hear from him to see if he was able to reincarnate and relay the combination, although to date, nothing has been heard. I hope this has given you a better insight into the scientific research that has gone into these ideas of reincarnation. Let me know if you want to see more videos on this subject, like what Jim Tucker and the division have been up to lately, more of the case studies in the past that Ian covered, or maybe a deeper dive into the criticisms and claims against them. Thanks for watching. Later.